Meanwhile, we're going to talk about a little something that maybe some of you have researched. Others of you might say, yeah, I think I've heard of that. See if we can enlighten some folks on this issue. It's the issue of GMO and GMO foods. And back with us today is author, attorney, and former Kellogg lobbyist George Franklin. You may know his book, Raisin Bran and Other Cereal Wars. George has been a guest of the show in the past, and he's back with us this morning. Hi, George.
Well, thanks for having me. Always enjoy being here.
Well, we enjoy having you. Welcome back. So, GMO, genetically modified organisms, we hear a little bit about this, but maybe we haven't immersed ourselves in this issue. What's going on here?
Okay, it's a fascinating combination of substance, politics, and process.
Yeah.
And I get a kick out of you if you didn't think it could get any crazier this year than political world than it has been. We've got the Republicans acting like Democrats and the Democrats acting like Republicans. Okay,
wow.
So what's new, right? What happened was not quite 2 years ago, the state of Vermont, 600,000 people in the state of Vermont, they decided that they would require food companies to label products that contained GMO ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the law goes into effect July 1. Well, what it has done is we've created a situation where a state of 600,000 people is now telling the entire country how they need to label. And just a couple of days ago, the National Academy of Sciences came out which was a 90% win for the food industry. It said, look, there's no material difference. There's no nutritional difference. There's nothing to be concerned about GMO ingredients in your food product. About 93% of the corn in the United States is GMO.
93.
99% of the beets are. And so it has a real Michigan impact in the sense that you're going to force food companies who don't want to have to label to go to other sources, and so they're going to leave the beet boys out to dry, out in the thumb. So that has significant impact on Michigan. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, let's be clear what GMO means. I mean, in theory, it sounds like it's a good idea, but there's certainly concerns with it. What is GMO?
Okay, what it is, it's using technology to change the seeds and the origins of products. Mm-hmm. And the idea was to make them more drought resistant, insect resistant, more productive, and it's using our technology to increase the food supply. Now, in fairness to the consumer groups, the one piece of the National Academy of Science study that came out 2 days ago, they said the question of how much it enhanced growth and productivity and production of food is somewhat ambiguous. But they did confirm the rest of the food industry's position that there's no need of concern. The food industry does not want to label because it's going to draw people's attention to something that might make them concerned for no legitimate reason. Mm-hmm. The other problem is you've got the state of Vermont, which I talked about the Republicans acting like Democrats and the Democrats acting like Republicans. What happened is the food industry has gone to Congress and asked them to preempt Vermont. And they're saying, look, you don't want this one state dictating all the other states. In fact, there's 4 other states with 55 million people that have rejected GMO labeling. So they're saying what you need to do is preempt Vermont, have a national, uniform, integrated food supply that has one labeling basis and not this patchwork, because if Vermont goes here, what about Rhode Island? What about Connecticut? You go down the pike.
The dominoes start to fall.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So what has happened is, and actually Michigan politically is the pivotal player in this whole issue. Wow. Fred Upton, chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, successfully navigated a bill through Congress called the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act, which the short version is it preempts Vermont. It says GMO labeling shall be voluntary.
A national law that would stop the state.
Right, right. The bill now is in the Senate, where it's in the Ag Committee over there, where the two negotiators are the Chairman Roberts from Kansas, and our own Debbie Stabenow from Michigan. So a compromise is being worked on. There's a lot of political heat being leveled on all sides. And so Michigan is sitting there with 2 of the key players in this whole controversy, in Senator Debbie Stabenow and Congressman Upton.
And we'll talk more about this in just a minute, including the notion that you pointed out, that there is a perspective that just putting the label out there in this way, alerting about GMO, would unnecessarily stir up dust, and we'll discuss that in just a minute, too. WBCK, we're here with George Franklin today. You know his book, maybe you've picked that up already, Raisin Bran and Other Cereal Wars, Kellogg lobbyist at one time, attorney, and today we're talking about GMOs and the notion that Vermont is trying to force food producers to put GMO labeling on their foods. That could have a ramification across the country, but now we have a Michigan contingent here with Fred Upton and Debbie Stabenow involved in the House and Senate in a national law that would be the determiner about whether or not this happens.
And the reason I talk about Republicans acting like Democrats, well, most people think of Republicans as conservative, which implies deferring to the states and the states' right to do sort of unfettered whatever not prohibited by the Constitution.
Sure.
So we have the Republicans leading the charge for preempting Vermont. You have the Democrats, who most people regard as liberal, which implies more federal control, less states' rights, leading the charge to defend Vermont's right to label GMOs. So we've got the world upside down. it's Washington as usual.
You know, the notion is interesting and understandable. What can we do using the technology we have available to us to do what you just said? Resist against drought, resist against pests, things of that nature that otherwise could trip up the food process and thus trip up profits and how easily we have access to certain foods and things like this. But is there a general undercurrent of caution or suspicion about GMO?
I mean, you can't deny the consumers. Once again, in fairness to consumer groups, they say people just have a right to know. Mm-hmm. They just have a fundamental right to know. The FDA, I guess you would say the National Academy of Science now, in the food industry, they said labeling this as containing GMO implies that it's some sort of frankenfood, that there's some sort of material difference between non-GMO and GMO, which has just not been scientifically determined. It's just the FDA says there is no material difference.
And at the root of that suspicion, we presume then, is a concern about health and exposure to these things, and we don't know what the future brings.
And that's the other argument that the consumer groups would make. They say, well, that's fine for right now, but we don't know what the impact of all this is down the road on our food systems, on the integrity of growing corn, of growing beets, and so on. And there's long-term ramifications. We don't know where we're headed with this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's volatile. It is impacts every consumer. Every listener here is going to be impacted. The only real study out there indicates that this would cost the average family about $1,000 a year more in food costs. And the reason is I had one Senate staffer just the other day. I was in Washington, actually with the Food Institute, and one Senate staffer said, well, just don't sell to Vermont. There's only 600,000 people, and there's still 325 billion in risk. The problem was with the supply chains of these big and small food manufacturers, the supply chains of the companies they sell to, Walmart, Target, Kroger,
big names.
Publix.
Yeah.
They can't just pluck out pieces of product and say, okay, we're not going to do this because it's going to Vermont, because it disrupts the entire supply chain. So it is so much more complicated, and part of the efficiencies of our integrated food supply system comes from those efficiencies, which once again, if you head down this road and do this with Vermont, it makes it practically impossible just to pluck out Vermont.
That's interesting because, somebody can make a supply of food product and be sophisticated enough to label one version of it Smucker's and label it another version Meyer brand or something.
Right.
But this pushes that limit then.
Yeah. And it's, the sourcing of the ingredients. I don't know where you would get enough corn if you had to go all non-GMO.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're going to force the people that are using GMO-containing corn, which, as I said, the latest figure I saw is about 93% of the corn supply, label it, and then people think it's some sort of frankenfood. Yeah. They go, well, what is this stuff?
Right.
And, you're scaring people. You're misleading people by implying that it's something it isn't. It's not different.
George Franklin is here. We're talking about GMO and non-GMO foods and the labeling therein. We'll pick up where we leave off in just a second here. 8:20. 24. George Franklin's here with us. Richard Piet Show Friday on WBCK. We're talking about GMO labeling. So I hate to sound suspicious, but what's the motivation for Fred Upton and Debbie Stabenow here to try and push this through?
Well, Senator Stabenow is trying to work out a compromise. And I think if anybody can do it, she probably can. Mm-hmm. People who don't realize that, may not know, that the last Congress, when she was chair, she managed to get through a bipartisan farm bill for a 5-year farm bill, which was huge. And it was bipartisan. And it was about the only thing bigger bipartisan happened in the whole Congress. So she's an experienced, classy legislator. The chairman is likewise. And they're working with variations, trying to accommodate people. And I've got to digress for a second. It's the classic. One of the things when I'm on my speaking tour about lobbying for business, people go to Washington guns blazing, my way or the highway.
Right.
It's ridiculous. There are 535 people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, with different interests, different communities. And as I like to point out, what does a cowboy from Wyoming have in common with a Hispanic from New York? Mm-hmm. Nothing. Mm-hmm. But they've got to compromise. And so this is a classic issue.
In theory, this situation could help them figure out what they have in common if
Absolutely.
they work at it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But this is the approach now, and as a lobbyist, you certainly know this climate. If you don't dig in and fight and work against compromise, you're seen as weak or something. What?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, the first one, some of you listeners might remember Senator Don Regal.
Oh, sure.
Senator Don Regal. And I'll never forget, I was a young lobbyist. He was a senator. Mm-hmm. And he said, he was one of the first ones that ever mentioned to me, it used to be you'd go to Washington to compromise and work things out. He said, now what you have to do is go to Washington and be totally unreasonable.
Yeah.
And demand your way, or you don't get it.
And maybe you might end up with part of what you want.
Part of what you want.
Yeah, and that used to be the approach about compromise.
Yeah.
You end up with part of what you want. Now you have to fight harder to get what you want.
Yeah. So, but I'm optimistic they're going to work something out. The stakes are too big. It has too much of an impact. The two players, as I said, are classy, experienced legislators. So I think they'll work something out. And then, of course, they've got to send it back to the House, and the House would have to accept it. So
right.
There's the other wrinkle. But, hey, that's the process. It's called our Constitution.
There's
and
a reason
those
why,
are the rules.
Yeah. Right, that's right. You know, it's interesting. You said corn 93% GMO these days. So if there is a concern about GMO foods out there, those who may have concerns over it may already be eating GMO.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, you've been eating it for 20, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, the growth of non-GMO foods is exponential. Just people, they want organic, they want non-GMO, they want natural. There's a whole trend which you can't ignore, and the food companies are not oblivious to that. They have to be realistic about what their consumers want. But trying to source it, supply it, and then label it is going to be quite a task between now and July, and then for shortly thereafter, because there just aren't the sources available. And as I said, for Michigan, the beet boys,
yeah,
basically they're all GMO. So what happens is, if you don't want to label GMO, you got to go to cane, which is out of Michigan.
The presumption then is that GMO has done what it was intended to do. True?
Yeah. I mean, they would argue that it has made crops healthier, more resistant, drought resistant, all sorts of aspects to it that have improved our food supply with no material difference from products that were non-GMO.
Mm-hmm. From your experience perspective, you want to call this somehow? They're going to work this compromise out?
Yeah, I think there'll be a compromise.
Yeah.
I may be in the minority, and I'm laughing because I watch all these talking heads talk about politics nowadays, and we keep listening to the same people that are all wrong. 6 months ago telling us who was going to win the election and how it was all going to play out.
Right.
But I'll go out on a limb. I think they'll work out a compromise.
All right. Well, it'll be interesting to see. And the Michigan players are right there at the center of it.
You got it.
Interesting, George. Thank you.
Thanks again.
George Franklin back with us on WBCK 820.